Our unalienable right to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, those rights were stripped from college kids in Blacksburg and Santa Barbara and from high schoolers at Columbine and from first graders in Newtown. First graders. And from every family who never imagined that their loved one would be taken from our lives by a bullet from a gun. Every time I think about those kids, it gets me mad.
This has gone on too long, and it's time the entire country stood up against the NRA.
If I could have gotten 51 votes in the Senate of the United States for an outright ban, picking up every one of them, Mr. and Mrs. America, turn them all in, I would have done it.
Colorado. Yeah. Why is it that Americans, to me it seems, so many Americans cannot divorce their right to defend themselves with a gun?
Well, Piers Morgan, we'll tell you. Our story begins on April 18th, 1775. Paul Revere has just crossed the Charles River and will ride on horseback to Lexington to warn the citizens of Massachusetts and his associates, Samuel Adams and John Hancock, of the pending arrival of the British regulars. They intend to disarm the citizens and arrest those who oppose the king. Revere was able to notify the members of the militia before his capture and was directly responsible for the American victory at Lexington and Concord, which ignited the revolution. You see, Mr. Morgan, gun ownership is undoubtedly and inherently American. Our nation was forged from the barrel of a gun. The United States is known as the land of the free. It is not free solely because we reside on land that is considered free, but because we, as a people, make it so. Our Second Amendment, which has been essential in our freedom as a nation and as individuals, is under extraordinary attack by left-leaning politicians, and this war on guns is exacerbated by the media as it demonizes lawful gun owners, presents misinformation, and ignores the real issues. Our founding fathers knew how important it was for citizens to be armed. It was so important that it was placed second in the list of amendments to our new nation's constitution. Now, I've heard the theory that these rules were written by a bunch of old dead white guys, and that they aren't in tune with today's sociological changes and progressive mentality. But if you can look past the idea that these men were wrong simply because they existed 2 centuries ago, you may in fact realize the true genius of our Constitution. The right to bear arms is not there solely for hunting deer or quail, as President Obama might have you believe. It is there for the citizens' protection, whether it be from a home intruder, a terrorist in a busy shopping mall, or our own government in the event it has become completely tyrannical. The Second Amendment gives the individual and the populace as a whole the assurance that he or she will be able to protect themselves and their families in any event. To hear politicians like Ms. Feinstein say that they would ban the Second Amendment if they could is not only frightening, but should give you a clear indication of how accurate our founding fathers were, regardless of how dead and white they are. By that logic, your freedom of speech is outdated, and your freedom of unreasonable search and seizure is also obsolete. These men knew exactly what they were doing and knew exactly what was necessary to ensure that the republic they fought so hard to form would last. It seems that every time you watch the news or surf the web, there is always something about a shooter or mass shooting, how bad guns are, and that something needs to be done. How many times in the past year or so have we seen President Obama demand something be done to stop these horrible atrocities, and that he will soon be unilaterally enacting more executive orders on gun control?
In Dr. King's words, we need to feel the fierce urgency of now.
Watching the news, you may be inclined to think that gun violence is at an all-time high. Well, violence due to firearms is actually down by about 50% since 1993. Let's talk numbers. There are almost 300 million legal guns in the United States. That's about one per every person. Every year, about 32,000 people are killed by firearms in the US. If you are someone who sees this number and then ends your research at that moment, then yes, 32,000 people a year is a terrible statistic, and more gun control seems like a great solution. However, let's explore this figure of 32,000. The Center for Disease Control says that of these 32,000 deaths, 20,000 are suicides. That leaves around 12,000 instances where someone is shot by another person in this country every year. That is still a very high number. Something definitely needs to be done. The NRA needs to be shut down. Right, Hillary? Of course not. Of these 12,000 or so deaths, 1,000 of them are police-involved shootings, and about 2,500 can be attributed to accidents. That leaves 8,500 intentional murders per year. Let's look at who is doing the shooting. Gang violence, while it may not be as high as it was in the 1990s, is still a huge part of these 8,500 deaths. So many people are victims of gang violence, robberies, assaults, and most of the crimes committed with the firearm are done by criminals who legally cannot own firearms anyway. In fact, so many illegal guns are used in shootings every year that numerous Justice Department studies have consistently shown that legally purchased guns in the hands of their rightful owners account for only 8% of all intentional shootings annually in this country. 8%. That is around 680 deaths per year by legal gun owners. There are on average about 300 justified shooting deaths by citizens using the guns for self-defense. That leaves about 400 wrongful deaths per year in the United States by lawful gun owners. That number is drastically different than the 32,000 consistently shown on the news. 400 lives are still 400 too many, but let's put it into perspective. 4,000 people are stabbed every year, 10,000 people are killed as a result of drunk driving annually, 50,000 people die from drug overdose, and there is a staggering 400,000 preventable deaths due to medical negligence and malpractice. That's right, you are 1,000 times more likely to die at the hands of a doctor than to be wrongly killed by a legal gun owner. Here's my question. Why in the past few years has gun violence been a primary talking point of the POTUS, media, and politicians, and furthermore, why is it legal gun ownership and the NRA that are continually bearing the brunt of the blame? Common misconceptions about guns. You can buy guns at a gun show without a background check. This is completely and utterly false. There is no place in the United States where you can legally buy a gun without a background check. Period. Assault weapons are being used to kill people. They are more lethal than normal guns. This is also false. What is an assault weapon? An assault weapon is a weapon that has select fire switch on the firearm. That means the user can switch between semi-automatic firing and fully automatic firing modes. Semi-automatic is when it takes one trigger pull for every round fired. In full auto, bullets will continuously fire at a high rate of speed so long as the trigger is held down. These weapons are used in military combat and are extremely hard to own in the US. You need a federal firearms license through the ATF in order to own and buy these weapons. You are also subject to extremely high tax regulations when buying these guns. It is typically law enforcement, historians, and collectors that own these types of guns. Remember, you need the permission from the feds to own these weapons. Legal assault weapons have not been responsible for many deaths in this country. In fact, there have only been 2 since 1934. You may ask, then why do I always hear about automatic or assault weapons being used in shootings? Politicians and the media prey on the misinformed population in order to get laws passed. There are already very strict regulations on actual assault weapons. They label normal, semi-automatic rifles as assault weapons when they truly are not. With this ambiguity, it is easier to enact very vague laws that are not always easy to understand and can be left to interpretation. In 2012, Adam Lanza took the lives of 26 beautiful children with an AR-15. It was an unimaginable tragedy and a heinous act. Remember though, that he murdered his own mother after stealing her guns. Given his mental illness, he would have never been able to legally own firearms. Why is it that banning the instrument he used to commit his crime seemed to be the best thing our politicians could come up with? What if he had used a knife or a sword? What if he had used bombs? What he did was illegal. Now what he used is illegal in Connecticut. The 30-round magazine he used is also outlawed in the state. What is the difference between one 30-round magazine and 3 10-round magazines in a school where people are unarmed and unable to fight back? There is no difference. However, our government has made you think otherwise, all the while using each shooting as a means to enact more and more gun control. In San Bernardino, Syed Farouk and Tashfeen Malik attacked a gun-free zone and killed 14 people. Legally purchased guns provided by Farouk's neighbor were used in the attack. The 2 gunmen had ties to known terrorists already under FBI investigation. Nothing was done to prevent this. However, only hours after the attack, the president gave his address which blamed the shooting on the availability of guns rather than the motive of radical Islamic jihad. Remember, these weapons were purchased legally using every background check and regulation in California, which happens to be one of the states with the toughest gun laws. Would even more laws prevent something like this from happening again? No. In fact, more laws would guarantee increased violence and more casualties. In November of last year, terrorists killed 130 Parisians. There are perhaps the world's toughest gun regulations in France. Are you beginning to see a pattern? These terrorists targeted a gun-free zone because there would be no opposition. Imagine the United States today had Dianne Feinstein been able to abolish the Second Amendment. Think of the carnage we would face if we had no way to protect ourselves and our families. So, why are some aspects of the government and media so focused on destroying the Second Amendment? Well, it is not for our safety. If increased regulations made us safer, then explain the skyrocketing murder rates in cities like Chicago and DC, where it is virtually impossible to own firearms. If guns didn't make people safer, the very politicians advocating for tighter restrictions, or even the complete eradication of the Second Amendment, would fire their security teams and personal bodyguards if they truly believed what they were telling you. The end goal is obscure at this point, but I can tell you that while the repeal of the Second Amendment doesn't guarantee government tyranny will happen, its loss will undoubtedly make it an irreversible possibility. As George Washington once said, firearms stand next in importance to the Constitution itself. They are the American people's liberty teeth and a keystone under independence.